Welcome to our third video in Sensation and Perception. This is Kristen Lazarova, and we're going to be exploring the Gestalt Principles of Organization. In this video, you're going to be exploring the Gestalt Principles of Organization, and these include figure ground, proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, and connectedness. As you learn about these different principles, I would think about when you see these in the real world. The more you can apply what you're learning to the real world and think about their application, the deeper your learning is going to be and the more meaningful it will be for you. The key point that's going to be underlying much of what you're going to be learning in this video is that psychologists study how the brain processes available sensory information to create perceptions and to make decisions. The brain creates a perception that is more than simply the sum of available sensory inputs. The brain does this in a predictable way, which Gestalt psychologists translated into principles by which we organize sensory information. So Gestalt psychology is an area of psychology that suggests that the whole is different from the sum of its parts, and that our brain creates a perception even when parts of the whole are missing. Figure ground perception is the idea that we tend to segment our visual world into figure and ground. So figure is the focus of the visual field, and then ground is the background. Our perception can vary depending on what we view as the figure and what we view as the ground. The concept of figure-ground relationship explains why this image here can be perceived either as a vase or as a pair of faces. What do you immediately see in this image? Do you see the shape of at least part of Africa, or are you seeing a mother and a child? What you see depends upon what you view as the figure and what you view as the ground. The Gestalt principle of proximity suggests that things that are close to one another tend to be grouped together. So if we look at figure A, we see one large block of dots. Whereas if we look at figure B, we see 3 columns of dots. And this is because we're grouping those things that are close to one another. So we see that these groups of dots, these 3 groups, we see them as groups because they're close to one another. Charts are an example of proximity. So here we see, for example, 2013 and 2014. And we see that these are 2 distinct pieces of information. We see that the blue and orange on the left is related to 2013 because those are close to one another, and the blue and orange on the right are connected to one another because they're close to one another. So both are explained by this principle of proximity. And here we have a game controller, and the buttons that are related to certain activities, they're close together on the controller. So we see the application or real world example of proximity. The Gestalt principle of similarity suggests that things that are alike tend to be grouped together. So as you look at this image, you are likely to perceive alternating rows of colors, as opposed to columns of yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue. You see rows of yellow and then a row of blue, a row of yellow, and a row of blue. We're grouping things that are alike. You can easily find the principle of similarity in many public spaces as you look at signs, for example. And using similar shapes and colors are ways that similar items can be grouped together. The Gestalt principle of continuity suggests that we're more likely to perceive continuous, smooth flowing lines rather than jagged, broken lines. So if you look at this image, we are likely to see 2 overlapping lines and not 4 lines that meet in the middle. Scatter plots are a great example of the Gestalt principle of continuity. If you look at this scatter plot, you can see that the dots seem to be moving in a direction. They all tend to be grouped together, and we see that as a person has a higher percentage of body fat, so too does their BMI go up. So we notice this principle of continuity here. The Gestalt principle of closure suggests that we organize our perceptions into complete objects rather than as a series of parts. So, for example, you perceive this as a circle even with parts missing. Google Doodles, like this one, they're a great example of the closure principle. Here, we don't need to have that extra O. We see something that looks somewhat like a circle, but probably regardless of what was in there, we would still see this as Google. We're closing in those incomplete pieces. The Gestalt principle of connectedness suggests that we tend to see objects as a group if there's something that connects them. So here we likely see 3 sets and not 6 circles because the lines connecting 2 circles together. Organizational charts are great examples of connectedness. You can see here, it's very easy to see who's connected beneath research and development, who's connected under operations, and so forth. So look at this image. What do you think? Do you think this is a duck or is it a rabbit? And how might you influence whether people see a duck or see a rabbit? So let's check your learning so far. Examining his doctor's handwriting on the prescription slip, Khalil completes the gaps in some of the lowercase letters to perceive an A and an O rather than 2 U's. This example illustrates the Gestalt principle of, and you can pause this for a moment if you need to. If you chose closure, you're right. And the reason that this is closure is we have a tendency to want to complete incomplete objects, and Khalil is completing the gaps in some of those lowercase letters so that he can perceive an A or an O rather than 2 U's. Let's try this one. Artie organizes the binders in his office by color. This color coding exemplifies the Gestalt principle of. If you chose similarity, you're right. And this is because the Gestalt principle of similarity suggests that we tend to group objects that are similar to one another. And Artie is taking advantage of that tendency that we have so that when he returns to his office at some point after having organized these binders, he's going to be able to easily note which binders belong together and some similar functions that these binders have that are based on color. In this video, you learned about the Gestalt principles of organization. And so what you learned is that humans tend to visually perceive layout or structure or whole over individual units. In essence, we perceive the whole structure or pattern over the sum of its parts. And as you can imagine, these principles that you've learned about have become popular in many different disciplines, like in visual art and design, in music, and in linguistics. They can also provide us with some understanding about human perception during communication. So you learned about Gestalt principles that include figure ground, proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, and connectedness. I encourage you, if you have any questions, to please let me know. And I look forward to seeing you online in our discussion forum.